Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the sophomore album from Amon Tobin, Bricolage. Alright, it's finally time to start talking about the music Amon Tobin released under his real name, and the material you probably already know from him the best. Obviously, this wasn't technically his debut album. I already reviewed his real debut, Adventures in Foam, which he released under the name Cujo in 1996. But this album, which released just a year later, was the first project to really start bringing Tobin's work to a wider audience, and the point at which he signed to a little label called Ninja Tune. Now, Ninja Tune was not the same kind of label we know it to be today, mostly pushing commercial downtempo and deep house music and the like, and bordering on just feeling like a few steps from a major label sometimes. Back in the 90s, Ninja Tune was still a little label, almost entirely centered around instrumental hip-hop artists combining electronic styles and breakbeats with lots of old-school jazz sampling. And sure, they had their share of decently acclaimed artists on their roster before Tobin. They had people like Funky Porcini, The Herbalizer, and DJ Food. The label itself was founded by the duo of instrumental hip-hop producers Cold Cut, and those guys are considered to be early pioneers for this particular style. But I feel like the point at which they signed Amon Tobin was the point at which this label really started to become more of a household name among music nerds. By the early 2000s, when Ninja Tune was home to people like Tobin alongside names like Bonobo, the Cinematic Orchestra, and Luke Vibert's Wagenkreist, among others, the label had grown into an enterprise that could be mentioned in the same breath as Warp Records. A center for loads of critically acclaimed electronic music, with Amon Tobin being their biggest star. Not only the most popular name at the time, but also probably the most actively cutting edge. Although, I am getting ahead of myself a little there. That transition obviously didn't begin immediately upon Tobin signing to the label. When he put out his first album under his real name here, he still fit very naturally into the kinds of jazzy breakbeat styles the label was already pushing. But I'd argue the release of this album was probably the point at which that transition began from Ninja Tune being Cold Cut's little independent home for jazz breaks into gaining the critical notoriety they still enjoy today. Especially considering that upon this album's release, it caught the interest of Ryan Schreiber, founder of a burgeoning music blog site called Pitchfork, on which he published a review of this album and gave it a score of a perfect 10 out of 10. Yes, fucking Pitchfork gave this album a 10 out of 10. Now, I don't know if I could say that fact necessarily carried the same weight at the time, considering Pitchfork itself had also only been around for like a year at that point, and were mostly just this small independent thing. I also can't confirm when exactly they published that review. It might have been later than it looks. But that still feels like a pretty important factor into how Amon Tobin and Ninja Tune would gain the level of notoriety they have today. Of course, as much as this album may have been subtly life-changing for the founder of Pitchfork, all of this is talking around my own feelings on Bricolage. I myself obviously wasn't exactly paying attention at the time this album released. I mean, I was 1.5 years old when it first came out. And I didn't hear Amon Tobin stuff until, I want to say, like my early college days, like 2014-ish. At the time I first got into him, I hadn't heard of Adventures in Foam. I thought this was his debut at the time. So this was my first exposure to his work. And at the time I first put it on, I remember really liking it, especially the way the album started, though I also don't remember much about the way I felt on the rest of it on first listen. In fact, I actually can't remember kinda struggling to pick out major standouts aside from the first two tracks, Stoney Street and Easy Muffin, and found other albums of his, especially the run of albums that would immediately follow this, to resonate with me on an even deeper level at the time, and get a lot more attention and replay value out of me. But after really sitting with Bricolage for this video all these years later, giving it as much attention as I could for the sake of actually writing about it and pinning down some more concrete feelings on it, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think this one holds up quite as well as other people seem to hold it up to. In fact, I think there's a good case to be made for Bricolage to be one of his weakest studio albums, if not just his weakest overall, although it would be close between this and Long Stories. Now, again, given the pedigree of Tobin's work, that doesn't necessarily say much. I do still think this is a pretty good album to decent at worst. My feelings on this album very closely echo my feelings on Adventures in Foam, since this is pretty much just a straight repeat of that album. album, with a lot of the exact same strengths and weaknesses. In fact, my feelings on this one line up with my feelings on a lot of that really, really early Ninja Tune jazz break stuff. Which is to say, I can easily respect what it did for the time it was released, although by today's standards, after having heard so many years of copycats and people taking directly from these playbooks, a lot of that mid-90s stuff can come off kind of mundane in comparison for me. I mean, hey, I generally like what I've heard from artists like Funky Porcini, DJ Food, and Cold Cut, but none of them have made albums I personally consider to be like all-time favorites, or stuff that's really brought me in for a lot of repeat listens, and Bricolage is very much in the exact same category as that. And the Square Pusher comparisons I made in my Adventures in Foam review also still stand here. I mean, that guy was putting out much better stuff in the same vein around the time, combining jazz and movie soundtrack influences with lots of hyperspeed breakbeats and drum and bass. And in fact, a month before this album came out, that guy put out his masterpiece, Hard Normal Daddy, which absolutely runs circles around any of this stuff. But the thing about Bricolage in particular is that while I think the production might be a slight step up from Adventures in Foam, I feel like this was actually an even less interesting listen, with lots of tracks whose focus is put squarely on simply chopping up amen breaks in ways that hundreds of artists have done in following years without really adding enough of a specific twist to them to be that memorable. And again, releasing in 1997 before these styles had become so commonplace allows Tobin to get away with it more in my mind. I don't have trouble imagining how someone in the 90s would have found this kind of stuff mind-blowing. But we also just had Adventures in Foam, which may have been ever so slightly amateurish feeling on the production end, but not by that much. And that album also felt like it had more substance and variety, with this feeling like a narrower version of the exact same kind of thing. And as many times as I put this album on, I keep feeling myself tuning out of like half the track listing, if not even more sometimes, as the experience just kind of runs together in one giant blur. And between that and the knowledge of how much astronomically better Tobin would get at doing this same kind of thing just a year later, yeah, this is at best a lateral move for him, and at worst an active step down. A serviceable reintroduction to an audience who hadn't heard of him yet at the time, and obviously one that left a strong impression on people back then, and will inevitably have lots of people who have a lot of nostalgia for this era aggressively yelling at me about it. But I would be lying if I said this would impress me in the same way if it came out in the exact same form today in 2025. But obviously not to rag on this album too much, I do not hate it by any stretch. I can still find a lot to like about this project. And as was the case when I first heard it, the best part of the album is still the very beginning. The one track from this album that I will never be able to forget the tune to no matter what is the album's opener, Stoney Street. The descending upright bass line and the way they go up against the trumpet lines and old school 1940s movie string sections is all but completely burned into my mind. And the breaks underscoring the whole thing are some of the loosest and most organic sounding in the bunch. Mind you, as unforgettable as this track is for me, and even if it is certainly my favorite cut in the bunch here, I wouldn't say it's the kind of thing that necessarily holds up great when you put it on for a lot of repeat listens. Like, it has its one straightforward idea and doesn't really iterate that much upon it. It gets a slight bit repetitive over time. I think there's even like a fake ending in the middle there that makes the whole track feel longer than it is. I have both had listens of this track when I thought it was really immersive and striking, as well as listens where I thought it was becoming annoying and I wasn't in the mood for it. It's not like one of my absolute favorite tracks Tobin has ever made or anything, but it is my favorite track on the album anyway. Though very close behind it and hitting a lot of similar notes for me is the immediately following track, Easy Muffin. This track was probably the biggest fan favorite from this album and used to be easily the most popular cut here due to its having been licensed out to commercials and the like. I think I even saw a car commercial relatively recently, like in the past couple of years, that still used the track as its backdrop. It was a very common starting point for people to get into Tobin's work. And that entire last sentence was obviously in the past tense because you cannot legally listen to this track anymore. It has been scrubbed from the internet permanently and taken off all streaming services. There aren't even any unofficial uploads on YouTube left completely intact because they instantly get blocked worldwide for copyright. There's clearly some kind of legal dispute around this track, which Tobin has, like, kind of vaguely acknowledged in passing, but just left it as being an issue that was fully out of his control. Some have theorized it's an issue due to uncleared samples. Some have theorized that the Lincoln Motors Company, which the track was licensed out to for their commercial, owned the full exclusive rights for the track, and that taking it off streaming was their choice, so that it could just be for their commercials and nothing else. Which that is a thing that those kinds of companies do, unfortunately. No reason for the track's deletion has been officially confirmed either by Tobin or anyone else at Ninja Tune. Either way, if you want to hear it on its own, you will have to resort to piracy. Now, as someone who still has his old download from over a decade ago still intact, I can confirm that Easy Muffin is one of the best tracks here. But I wouldn't say it's like the most mind-blowing thing ever either. Like, the mix of moody electric pianos and trumpets going over simple, slowed-down amen breaks is very nice and smooth and buttery. It's kind of the logical midpoint between the approaches of its two surrounding tracks on the album, and it transitions well out of them. I do personally believe the album is actively made worse by removing it. But unlike that other really popular track from 2 albums later which got the exact same treatment, I do just view this to be a very nice track and not a home run necessarily. I feel like Stoney Street feels more lively and well-textured, stood out from the crowd of this genre a bit more if you ask me, but we're splitting hairs here. Good melodies are good. I suppose if it's any consolation, Easy Muffin does sound very similar to the next track, Yasawas, which has a very similar pattern of electric pianos which almost seems to border on continuing directly off the last track, to the point where I even get their tunes mixed up with each other in my head sometimes. Although this track gets much more abstract about it and ramps up the amen breaks in a bunch of parts. And that makes for a good segue into pretty much everything afterwards, as the album turns into something else entirely and stays in that territory until the end. That initial run of 3 tracks is easily the most memorable part of the album, and Yasawas is kind of the last moment for the album to feature a strong melodic hook. Everything afterwards is just kind of a blend of very standard breakbeat chops with mildly jazzy samples pasted on top. And a lot of these tracks seem to be built on the assumption that the drumming from the breakbeats would come off impressive enough on their own, but given the breakbeats he uses are just mostly the exact same ones everyone else uses, mostly just like regular old amen breaks and stuff. Once again, I'd be lying if I said this stuff really popped out to me in the way it might have to people back in 1997. I mean, he's not like editing these breaks on like square push or go plastic level of detail here, or getting all that flashy or clever with them. His approach to the breaks on this album is pretty vanilla, honestly. But that's not to say some fairly vanilla jazzy breakbeat material can't still be fun for what it is. In fact, the album does have its fair share of other nice enough standouts that I did grow to like with enough repeat listens of this thing. Creatures bookends itself with 2 pretty cool sections of creepy, bassy ambience covered in odd wind chimey noises that I think are cool, even if the amen breaks in between are just kind of there for me. I also quite liked One Day in My Garden. The guitar melodies on that one definitely stand out from the crowd for being much breezier and more lighthearted than pretty much anything the album had been exploring after Easy Muffin, and there is a cool section of breaks and dark ambience in the middle too. There's also the off-kilter bass guitar loops of Defocus, which we're able to stick in mind a little more easily the more times I put this thing on, and the way the following track, The Nasty, kind of mirrors it with its upright bass loops carrying a similar rhythm, while also adding on more tuneful elements like synth vibraphones and some other maybe trumpets or other horns. That was quite nice. And I guess I can maybe throw in Wires and Snakes as one of the more memorable cuts past the opening stretch. Although that's less because of the mildly chilling atmospheric synth-pad progressions the track is primarily built around, and more because of its utilizations of a bunch of sound effect samples copied from the future sound of London's Papua New Guinea. I would assume that is meant to be a direct homage. I would think no 90s electronic artist is just going to use those classic metallic ping noises without intentionally hoping to immediately bring that specific track to mind. And I'm obviously always game for a good Future Sound of London homage, but it does also kind of just make me want to put on Accelerator instead. That album holds up much better to me than this one, although that is also very much an apples and oranges type comparison. But beyond that, that's kind of all the most interesting moments this album has to offer. I don't have any annoyances with the remaining tracks or feel the active urge to skip them, but everything else falls in the background for me super easily. A track like Chomp Samba may be a fan favorite by my understanding, but it focuses on literally nothing but standard breakbeat workouts and some menacing bass. That's kind of it. There's not really any twist there, it just relies on you getting into the heavy and percussive mood of the breaks themselves, taking the genre name drum and bass quite literally there. And much of the ending stretch of this album focuses on tracks of this specific nature too, juicy tracks like Dream Sequence, One Small Step, and Mission. The former and latter of those three do try to spice things up with a few influences from Indian music and adding in like sitars and stuff. Although, I kind of wish those elements were more present throughout the full length of the track instead of relegated to, like, a few specific moments. I don't realize Dream Sequence is playing until, like, halfway into the track. And Mission also kind of makes for a bit of an arbitrary feeling finish to the record. It's just kind of whatever. And the remaining two tracks I haven't mentioned yet that really lean into the jazzier side of the spectrum don't really blow me away either. Bitter and Twisted feels like it's remixing a bunch of ideas he already used on Defocus and the Nasty, but just scattering them around willy-nilly, I guess. And New York Editor is just kind of a downbeat mood with some wailing trumpet licks and sluggish beat loops that get a little, like, drunk and honestly kind of tedious feeling. That track is also just kind of whatever. There's like 8 tracks on Adventures in Foam that sound like it and do the same idea better. Oh yeah, and I guess I can mention the 2 Japanese bonus tracks which were cut out of the Creatures EP that he released in the lead up to this album. You got Day Trip, which has some more guitar loops and hip-hop beats. It's a thing that exists, I guess. It does apparently sample Jaco Pastorius, so I guess that's neat, but the way Tobin presents his samples is kinda on the lifeless and plain side for my liking. And the other exclusive bonus track is Shiny Things, which, to be fair, does have some actual sense of urgency and tension in the way its bass and horn samples try to make a mildly creepier feeling sound. So I guess I'll take that, though if it had been included on the album itself, I don't know if it would have stood out to me in context either. So yeah, I guess that's going to be everything to talk about on Bricolage. Look, if it may sound like I'm being overly harsh to this album, that's mainly because Tobin's work after this set a way higher standard. Tobin would become known for being way more creative and envelope-pushing. That goes for when he kept evolving this particular jazz break sound and took it into much fresher feeling territory he could so much more easily call his own, or even later in this catalog as he started to gradually move away from samples and get much more out there with his sound design. Compared to the caliber of the work he would put out afterwards, Bricolage is almost pedestrian. It feels like the kind of thing that any jazz break producer at the time could have done. This could have easily passed as like a DJ Food album or a Funky Porcini album. Heck, Funky Porcini kinda did make an album that hits almost the exact same note as this, with Love, Pussycats, and Car Wrecks around the exact same time. Your mileage may vary which one you prefer. And again, all of this is well and good. I like jazz sampling, I like amen breaks. This stuff can all be a fun mood sometimes. It just, you know, kind of feels redundant to me when I know he did this exact same kind of thing even better elsewhere. There's parts of this album that almost feel like Tobin was just like pulling up leftovers that didn't make the cut for Adventures in Foam and polishing them up a bit. And obviously it really does not help that what used to be the most popular track on the album by far got cut out of the album entirely. But regardless of whether that track is present or not, chances are the Center of People's Nostalgia is going to be very squarely in that opening stretch, maybe up through Chomp Samba. I know a lot of people like that one more than I do, but even I remember what this album used to look like on the iTunes store, with like the one track being way more popular than the others and everything else just slowly trailing off in popularity as you got closer to the end of the album. Now, can I still recommend checking out this album? Yes. I mean, allow me to remind people that I am just one person and I can only speak for my own personal experience. Let it be known that I am actually very much in the minority with my mostly lukewarm feelings on this one. Loads of people still absolutely love this album, and I am fully expecting to see plenty of those people get quite unhappy with my take on this one in the comments. I mean, did I mention that Pitchfork gave this a freaking 10 out of 10? Clearly someone got something fundamentally life-shifting out of hearing this, so even if that very much did not happen for me, the chances seem to be high enough that it'll hit better for you to make it worth giving a shot anyway. But if we're purely going off my own personal experience, I think this stuff is all nice enough, but I just wouldn't put it among his most essential work. I feel like the reason this record is important was not necessarily because of anything it does on a musical level, but rather because it got his foot in the door. It introduced him to an audience who was already into this exact kind of music, and primed them to become his core audience. The real classics from him that would prove why Amon Tobin is still a name people remember so well up through present day are yet to come. And they obviously would not need to wait long to get to that, but yeah, in the meantime, I personally just think this album is merely decent to pretty good at best, and I'm feeling a very strong 6.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list. The link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.